If someone had told me that danger could walk into your home, wearing a smile, carrying a homemade meal, and calling you dear, I would have laughed. But that was before I learned that harm doesn't always arrive as a threat. It sometimes enters as a favor. I used to think my life was steady, predictable even. A small townhouse, a quiet marriage, a mother-in-law who hovered but seemed harmless enough. She cooked for us often, insisting it was her love language, her way of staying connected. And I tried, truly tried, to see it as generosity rather than intrusion. But then my stomach started twisting on random afternoons. I'd find a strange smell in meals that were supposedly fresh. And each time I tried to bring it up, her smile only widened, as if my discomfort were something she could smooth over with another portion. The worst part wasn't the sickness, it was the doubt. The way I started questioning my own senses. The way my husband, gentle as he was, kept brushing it all aside because Mom means well. Meaning well became the shield she hid behind, until the day I found something in my food no one could ignore. This story isn't about conflict for the sake of drama. It's about what happens when instinct whispers long before logic catches up. It's about the moment you realize you're not paranoid, you're in danger. And it's about how far a woman must go to reclaim her own safety inside the walls of her own home. If you've ever felt dismissed, doubted, or silenced, stay with me. This story is for you. And before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, where truth finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. The townhouse row where Jake and I live always looks calmer from the outside. Clean sidewalks, trimmed hedges, the kind of place people imagine as the final stop of a young couple's bright beginning. I'm 29, working in a mid-level office job that eats every daylight hour, and newly married to a man who grew up 2 blocks from here. The evenings are my favorite. Cool hallway air, the faint hum of the automated gate at the entrance, and the soft click of our porch light as it scans each arriving license plate. I used to find that comforting, the way machines seem to understand order better than people did. The light blinks twice whenever Marion's car pulls in. The sensor must love her sedan because it always seems to glow brighter for her. I've noticed that. Or maybe I've been noticing everything too closely these days. The past few weeks, something in me has been restless, quiet, cautious, as if waiting for a sound I can't name. Still, when I walk through that front door, I try to tell myself, this is home. This should be easy. Marion, my mother-in-law, has a reputation stretching across 3 generations of their family. The woman who keeps a home standing with her cooking. Jake says it with affection. His aunts say it with reverence. Everyone knows the story of how she raised him alone, how every hardship was somehow folded into a dish she perfected. Her words ring like family gospel. Anyone who eats what I make stays, because they feel loved enough not to leave. The first time she told me that, I laughed politely, unsure how to hold a sentence layered with both pride and warning. She speaks with the confidence of someone who's had to make her own rules, her own warmth, her own authority, mostly in the kitchen. And when she's in ours, she moves with the kind of gentle possession women develop after a lifetime of feeding others. I've tried to match her energy, to seem grateful, open, good. The truth is, I never know if I'm being welcomed or evaluated. Marion's gaze has a way of being both. For months, I've been careful with food. My stomach isn't dramatic, just quietly unreliable. I spent years medicating it, negotiating with it, apologizing to it. So recently, I started making my own lunches again. Simple rice bowls, lightly seasoned chicken, soft vegetables that don't startle me. It's silly how proud it made me feel. Opening my own little containers each day, knowing exactly what went into them, feeling my body react with something like relief. It felt like control, the soft kind, the kind that doesn't brag. Even Jake noticed the difference, saying I looked less folded in. I liked that. I thought I'd finally found a rhythm. Wake up, pack my lunch, breathe through traffic, let my stomach forget the years it flinched at the wrong things. I didn't expect anyone else to care about it. I certainly didn't expect Marian, who never leaves a kitchen without an agenda, to take an interest in my small routines. But she did. So quickly it felt like she'd been waiting. The first time she showed up with a neatly wrapped bento box, she pressed it into my hands with a brightness that felt rehearsed. "So you don't have to wake up early," she said. "You work too hard for a girl your age." Her tone was creamy sweet, but her eyes did a quiet sweep of my counters. My knives drying, my cutting board still damp, my own lunchbox tucked against the backsplash. She lifted her chin like she was checking whether I had already cooked. "Let me lighten your load," she added. I smiled, thanked her, tried to make my voice sound grateful rather than startled. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the gesture. It was the way she watched me accept it, like she was measuring my reaction, cataloging my sincerity, waiting to see if I'd earn her approval with a single bite. Jake brushed it off when he got home, saying, "That's just her way." Her way feels more like a test than a gift. That night, after showering and putting on the soft cotton shirt I wear when I want to feel grounded, I finally opened the box. The moment the lid lifted, a faint sourness drifted out, almost apologetic. I stared at it under the kitchen light. Perfectly arranged vegetables, glossy rice, a piece of fish that glistened in a way I couldn't decipher. I told myself I was tired, that my senses were exaggerating. I didn't want to insult her. So I took a few bites, small ones, careful ones, the way you taste something at a stranger's potluck. The flavor was off. Not bad, just like it didn't recognize me. I kept my face neutral, even though I was alone, as if someone might still be watching. My stomach tightened, not in pain but in anticipation, its old defensive twitch. I closed the box halfway, then all the way, then pushed it gently to the back of the fridge. "Be polite," I whispered to myself. "She means well." I wanted to believe that. Later, when I opened the fridge for water, the cold air met the bento box and the lid released a soft, sharp tsk, a tiny pop that echoed louder than it should have. A thin thread of sourness touched my face. I paused, hand still on the door, the kitchen buzzing faintly behind me. The red lid seemed to stare back, glossy under the refrigerator light, innocent in the way only objects can be. I felt a small pinch behind my ribs, something instinctive, a contraction of caution I couldn't explain. Then I shook it off, let out a breath, and smiled in that practiced way women do when they want fear to look like gratitude. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I wanted too much control. Maybe. Still, when I reached up to close the fridge, my fingers hesitated over that red lid, the way you hesitate before touching something that might be warm. By the third week, the pattern stopped being a coincidence. I'd eat the bento at noon, just enough to seem polite, and by 3 o'clock the first pinch would creep across my stomach, thin and precise like a wire tightening. The office air always feels colder in the afternoon, but on those days it felt surgical. I'd sit in the break room pretending to scroll my phone, trying to breathe through the tension blooming under my ribs. The odd thing was the consistency. It never happened on the days I brought my own food. Only on the days Marian handed me a box with that gentle smile and that soft, coaxing tone. I started noting the times in my head, not on paper yet, just little mental bookmarks. Tuesday, 3:12. Thursday, 3:47. Each time the same nausea rising like a slow tide, the same fuzzy heat spreading along my neck. I didn't want to assume the worst, I just couldn't ignore what my body already knew. Something wasn't right. Whenever Marian handed me a new box, she would rest her palm on the lid for half a second too long, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. "Eat all of it, sweetheart," she'd say. "Food isn't meant to be wasted." Her tone never wavered, soft, lilting, affectionate in a way that pressed rather than soothed. She always added, "I worked hard on it." as though rejecting the meal would be rejecting her devotion, rejecting her history, rejecting the entire mythology that held her identity together. I smiled each time, thanked her, and felt the weight of that gratitude like a stone I had to swallow. There was no room for negotiation in her voice. It was tender, but it was narrow, a kindness that demanded proof. Jake brushed it off every time I brought it up. "Mom just overdoes things," he'd say, half laughing, half exasperated. "It's how she loves." He meant well, but the dismissal grated in its simplicity. Love isn't supposed to make you brace. Still, he believed every gesture from her came from a pure place. I didn't fault him for it, he was raised to. But each time he waved my concern away, I felt something settle between us, invisible but heavy, like a curtain he didn't notice had dropped. When I asked, "Would you eat it if it made you sick?" he said he would talk to her. The answer wasn't unkind, it just wasn't enough. He never felt the cramps. He never saw the little tremors in my hands at my desk. He never tasted the faint sourness that kept haunting me even hours later. I began quietly throwing away parts of the meals. Just the ones that smelled strongest or had a sheen that caught the light wrong. I'd stand by the office trash can, waiting for the room to empty, then tip a portion in, letting it fall silently beneath a layer of paper towels. It felt wrong to waste food, but it felt worse to force my body to endure something it was begging me to refuse. And yet there was guilt, sharp, childlike. Guilt for not being the good daughter-in-law, for not receiving kindness the right way. I hid the empty spaces in the box under the remaining rice, smoothing the surface with my fork like smoothing over a lie. None of this made sense in words, but in motion, in the quiet choreography of avoidance, it made far too much sense. One afternoon, Marian noticed a nearly untouched box on the counter when she stopped by unannounced. She lifted the lid with the care of someone opening a gift they expect to disappoint them. "Still full," she said lightly, her smile wrapped so tightly around her teeth it looked painful. Some people are difficult to please, even with home cooking. She said it as though addressing the air, but her gaze flicked to me like a tiny blade. I swallowed the sting and murmured something about being tired. The moment passed, but not for me. It sat in my chest the rest of the night, humming with accusation. In her eyes, a full bento wasn't just uneaten food, it was betrayal. Soon I realized the box wasn't a meal anymore. It had become something else entirely, a silent evaluation, a daily exam I hadn't agreed to take. Each untouched bite felt like a point deducted. Each attempt to finish it felt like conceding ground I didn't know I was supposed to defend. I caught myself inspecting every grain of rice, every piece of fish, as though trying to anticipate the question hidden inside. It wasn't fear yet, not quite. More like the early tremor of unease that grows from repetition, from patterns you don't want to acknowledge. And in the soft hum of my kitchen at night, as I rinsed the boxes clean, I started asking myself a question I'd been avoiding. What if this isn't about food at all? At work, humor became my soft shield. One afternoon, while everyone hovered around the microwave, waiting for reheated leftovers, I joked, "If my stomach can survive my mother-in-law's bento boxes, I think I could probably audition for a steel commercial." The room burst into the kind of easy laughter that only happens when people think you're joking. Their laughter warmed me for a second. Light, uncomplicated. Nothing like the heaviness that waited at home. I let myself enjoy it, even leaned into it, though the truth sat differently underneath. The joke wasn't a punchline. It was a breadcrumb. A way of saying something is wrong without having to expose the wound. Humor has a way of letting you breathe when you don't want to tremble. I stood there smiling with my coworkers, the break room humming with the stale smell of coffee, and thought, these strangers think I'm funny. If only they knew I wasn't joking. Marian rarely confronted me outright, but she had a talent for planting ideas in Jake's mind. One evening over dinner, he said, "Mom thinks maybe your stomach just isn't used to home cooking. You've eaten takeout for years, so maybe it's an adjustment." He didn't even realize he was quoting her verbatim. I stared at the pasta he'd made, overcooked, uneven, perfectly imperfect, and wondered how a woman who'd survived so much could weaponize tenderness so neatly. Jake wasn't malicious. He just repeated things without weighing them. His mother's voice was carved deep into him. He didn't notice how his words landed on me, each one like a small nudge pushing me toward self-doubt. I wanted to remind him that my stomach had never rebelled against my own cooking. But I said nothing. Silence is easier than sounding defensive over meals you didn't ask for. The next time Marian stopped by with another box, I forced a tight smile and said, "You have a very unique way of strengthening my digestive system." It was meant to sound lighthearted, but the words came out edged, a little too honest. Marian's smile stretched, careful and thin. "Oh, honey," she laughed. "You'll thank me later." Her eyes, though, narrowed just a little, like she couldn't quite decide whether I was being playful or disrespectful. I couldn't decide either. Sometimes humor is just anger arranging itself into a gentler shape. I set the box down on the counter, my fingers brushing its cool surface. I felt a pulse of unease, quick and fleeting. She didn't drop her gaze from me until she was sure I picked it up again. That look, quiet, assessing, drifted with me through the rest of the evening. That night, I opened a small notebook I'd kept tucked in my desk drawer for months and began writing. Not thoughts, facts. Dates, times, what I ate, how I felt afterward. Tuesday, Bento. 15:40, sharp cramp. Wednesday, my own lunch, no symptoms. I kept it clinical, almost like charting someone else's body, someone else's pain. Putting it on paper gave everything shape. Patterns stopped being paranoia when they had timestamps. Between notes, I would pause, listening to the house breathe, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside the window. Everything felt still except my mind. Each line steadied me, even when the truth behind the data felt like a quiet threat gathering density. I didn't know what to call any of this yet. I just knew it needed a record, something outside my own memory. Later, when Jake came into the kitchen, I tried telling him again, softly, hoping he'd hear the fear beneath the words. "I just want you to take this seriously," I said. "It's not nothing." He kissed my forehead, dismissing the tension with a gesture that was meant to soothe, but instead felt like a lid sliding shut. "Don't turn a small thing into a whole investigation," he murmured. I smiled back because it was the only way not to turn the moment into a fight. Still, as he walked away, the phrase clung to me like humidity. A small thing. My body didn't feel small when it was doubled over a desk. My instincts didn't feel small when they recoiled at certain smells. His gentleness felt like erasure, and for the first time, I wondered if love could coexist with disbelief. The next day, Marian stopped by again, placing another neatly packed box on the counter. As she slid it forward, the lid rolled once, a slow, deliberate circle, and stopped at the very edge of the folded kitchen towel. I reached out to steady it, and my fingertips brushed plastic that felt strangely cold, colder than it should have been from a room-temperature box she'd just carried inside. A shiver traveled through me, not dramatic, just a small electric warning. She didn't seem to notice. Or she did, and pretended she didn't. I wrapped my hand around the box as she gave me that familiar look, expecting compliance disguised as gratitude. I held the box, nodded, and kept my face neutral. But inside, something shifted. Small, firm, undeniable. a quiet voice whispering that this was no longer about food. At noon, the office looked bleached under the harsh neon lights, every surface too bright, too exposed. I sat alone in the break room, the bento Marian had dropped off that morning, resting untouched beside my laptop. I told myself I'd eat quickly before the afternoon meeting, just enough to keep the peace. The room smelled faintly of burnt popcorn and disinfectant wipes, sterile, indifferent. I peeled back the lid, its plastic giving a soft resistance, like it didn't want to open. As steam escaped, my reflection warped across the shiny surface of the rice. I tried to steady my breath. Maybe today would be different. Maybe the unease in my stomach was just stress. I lifted my chopsticks, letting the room blur for a second as I tried to convince myself that this was just lunch, nothing more. It's remarkable how you can lie to yourself with a straight face when you want harmony badly enough. The first bite hovered midair when I saw it. Small, rigid, unmistakably lifeless. A bug tucked beneath a thin blanket of rice, legs curled inward like a secret it wasn't meant to keep. My stomach lurched before my mind could catch up. The chopsticks clattered softly against the container. For a moment, all I heard was the hum of the refrigerator behind me, steady and indifferent. The sight wasn't grotesque so much as humiliating. It felt like being mocked by something tiny, something that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. My face heated with a sudden wave of embarrassment, even though no one was there to witness it. My throat tightened the way it does when you're blindsided, not by danger but by disrespect. I snapped the lid shut, hands trembling, the box now pulsing with a kind of quiet violation I couldn't name. I rushed to the restroom, the fluorescent hallway spinning as though the floor had tilted slightly under my feet. Inside the mirror's reflection, my face looked unfamiliar, pale, eyes sharper than I remembered. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. It wasn't just the disgust, it was the implication. Someone else might have shrugged it off, blamed it on a stray bug, bad luck. But I had felt the pattern building, felt the slow erosion of trust with each sour smell, each stomach cramp. I inhaled deeply, trying to pull my scattered thoughts into a straight line. My eyes stung and I blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall in a public bathroom like I was unraveling over something small. It wasn't small. It didn't feel small. It felt targeted, intimate in the worst way. Standing there beneath the cold lights, I imagined the scene if someone else had seen what I just did. Coworkers laughing, exchanging knowing looks, whispering about how I couldn't even handle a homemade lunch. I hated that instinctive shame, how quickly it clawed up my spine. I wasn't afraid of the bug. I was afraid of being reduced to a punchline. I straightened, wiped my palms on my skirt, and forced myself to breathe slowly. "You're not fragile," I whispered, not as comfort, but as a reminder. I didn't want this to be the story anyone else wrote about me. My hands still trembled, but I felt something steadier beneath them. The quiet anger that rises when dignity is poked at too many times. I knew then, this wasn't an accident I could politely excuse. My phone buzzed in my pocket, 3 short vibrations, perfectly spaced. I wiped my eyes, pulled it out, and saw the message glowing on the screen. "I made that box special for you today. Don't waste it. It hurts my heart when you do." The sweetness in the words felt artificial, like syrup poured over something sharp. My breath hitched. The timing, too aligned, too knowing, sent a cold ripple across my skin. I stared at the closed bento in the trash can, imagining it sitting there like a prop in a play I never auditioned for. The message wasn't a reminder, it was a command cloaked in sentiment. And for the first time, it didn't land as care. It landed as control. Back at the break room, I dropped the bento into the trash, burying it beneath paper towels until the sight disappeared. But the feeling didn't. The humiliation clung like residue, impossible to rinse off. I walked back to my desk with a tightness in my chest that felt more like betrayal than disgust. As I sat down, the overhead lights flickered briefly, casting everything in a washed-out gray. I stared at my blank screen, hands motionless, mind replaying the image of that curled-up insect again and again. The question rose unbidden, sharp, intrusive, undeniable. If this wasn't accidental, then what was it? I didn't have the answer, but I could feel the ground beginning to shift beneath the story I'd been telling myself. That evening, while Jake rinsed dishes under the warm glow of the kitchen light, I stood beside him and tried again to explain what had happened. The bug, the message, the way my stomach had twisted long before any food touched it. I kept my voice level, steady, because I didn't want emotion to be the thing he reacted to. He paused, water running over his hands, and looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief, the way someone might look at a person describing a nightmare that doesn't match daylight. "I think you're seeing this in the worst possible way," he said softly. "Mom isn't like that." His tone wasn't cruel, just protective, of the wrong person. The words landed with a quiet thud inside me. There's a loneliness that comes from being unheard. Then there's a deeper one, being unheard in your own kitchen. I tried a different angle. "If you found a bug in something I made for you, would you still eat it?" I asked, watching his expression closely. Jake hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'd probably tell Mom," he said, avoiding the part of the question that mattered. The avoidance felt like its own answer. It wasn't malice, it was habit. He was raised to default to her, to soften anything that might cast her in a harsh light. I knew he loved me, but love isn't enough when someone refuses to see what scares you. The distance between us stretched, invisible but tangible, as though the kitchen counters had moved farther apart. I turned away, feeling the air around me grow thinner. Even standing side by side, we didn't feel like a team. That night in bed, I lay facing the wall while Jake settled beside me. His breathing was even, calm, untouched by the weight that sat like a stone on my chest. The ceiling fan spun slow circles, stirring air that suddenly felt too cool. I stared at the faint shadows cast by the street lights outside, wondering when the bed we shared had started to feel like two separate islands. I could feel Jake reach toward my back, pause halfway, then pull his hand away, as though unsure how to bridge the silence between us. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt in the traditional sense. I was alone, quietly, unmistakably alone, with a truth he refused to look at. Loneliness in marriage doesn't come with noise. It comes with someone breathing peacefully beside you while you stare into the dark. The next afternoon, Marian stopped by unannounced again. Her footsteps were light, almost ceremonial, as she entered the kitchen with another paper bag. She spotted an untouched container from the day before and lifted the lid as if inspecting a student's half-finished assignment. "Still full," she remarked, her tone light enough to pass as humor to anyone who didn't know better. "Don't tell me you're throwing away home cooking." I forced a smile, keeping my hands neatly folded on the counter. "My stomach's been unpredictable," I replied. She hummed, as if indulging a child's excuse. The air between us felt brittle. Her gaze lingered on me a second too long, as if searching for proof of disobedience. I said nothing more. Sometimes silence is the only shield you can hold without dropping it. My smile stayed in place even as my chest tightened. There was a strange tension in being scrutinized by someone who insisted it was love. Her eyes softened just enough to pass as concern, but the sharpness underneath never dulled. It made me feel small, not in size, but in permission, like I was expected to shrink myself to fit her idea of gratitude. I'd never asked her to cook for me. I'd never asked her to prove anything. Yet here I was, trying not to flinch under the weight of her expectations. For a brief moment, I wondered what I looked like to her. An interloper, a threat, a woman stealing her son's loyalty without meaning to. Standing there, I felt myself retreat inward, holding my breath the way you do when stepping through a doorway in the dark. By the time she left, a quiet truth settled over me. I was standing in the center of a home that didn't quite feel like mine. Not because of walls or furniture, but because the people inside it didn't see the same reality I did. I wasn't being believed, not fully, not honestly. And worse, I wasn't being respected. I watched the door close behind Marion, the soft click of the lock sounding heavier than it should. I leaned against the counter, letting the stillness of the house wrap around me. That sense of being caught between two worlds, hers and mine, tightened like an invisible thread. I wasn't imagining any of this. I wasn't overreacting. The unease had shape now, a shadow that followed me from room to room. I just didn't yet know how to name it. By the end of the week, my nerves felt stretched thin, like threads ready to snap. I needed someone who wasn't involved, someone who wouldn't dismiss me out of loyalty or habit. So I walked next door to Lily's townhouse, the evening air cool against my skin. Lily worked night shifts as a nurse. She had the kind of grounded, unflinching presence that made you believe she saw through surfaces. When she opened the door in her scrubs, hair loosely tied back, she blinked at the sight of me holding a full bento box. "This looks serious," she said, stepping aside. Inside, her living room smelled faintly of jasmine tea and antiseptic. Clean, calm, unpretentious. I placed the container on her coffee table, my hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. "Can you check this?" I asked. Her brows rose, not in judgment but in attention, the kind you give someone who finally admits they're not imagining things. Lily unlatched the lid with the precision of someone accustomed to inspecting questionable things. She leaned in, inhaled gently, then frowned. "This is off," she said plainly. "Either it was stored wrong or it sat out too long." She tapped the edge with her finger, thoughtful. "You said this isn't the first time?" I nodded, watching her face more closely than the food. She didn't flinch or soften her words. She examined the fish, the rice, the vegetables. None of it maliciously, just clinically. "If this keeps happening," she continued, "it's not an accident anymore. I've seen situations where food gets used as leverage, or as control." Her tone was steady, matter-of-fact, but the implication cut through the room like a cold draft. My breath stalled. Hearing someone name what I'd only dared think felt grounding and terrifying all at once. A weight eased off my chest, only to be replaced by another, heavier, more concrete. Relief isn't always soft. Sometimes it lands with a thud. "I thought I was being dramatic," I murmured. Lily shook her head. "Your body's reacting for a reason. Don't ignore that." She sat back, arms folded lightly, studying me with the same care she would give a patient describing symptoms they were afraid to take seriously. "Trust yourself," she said, "and don't wait until it gets worse." Her steady tone made the words settle differently, like they had permission to stay true. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, feeling my pulse soften into something steadier. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was clarity. And clarity, I realized, can be its own kind of ache. On the short walk home, I replayed Lily's questions, her observations, her certainty. The path between our houses was lined with identical porch lights, glowing like quiet sentinels. Her words echoed in my chest. Leverage, control. They weren't accusations, they were possibilities, ones I had avoided naming out loud. The closer I got to my door, the more those possibilities took shape. I had been giving someone else the benefit of every doubt while dismissing my own instincts. Maybe out of politeness, maybe out of fear, maybe both. But walking through the washed-out evening light, I felt something settle in me. A decision beginning to form, not yet articulate, but undeniably present. As I stepped onto my porch, the motion sensor flicked on, flooding the entryway with warm yellow light. The glow swept across the kitchen counter inside, where another unopened bento box sat, waiting from earlier that afternoon. The lid caught the light for a brief second, gleaming like a quiet reminder, an object that should have meant nourishment, now charged with suspicion. The whole scene felt strange, as if the house itself was showing me something I'd tried not to see. I set my keys down slowly, letting the moment stretch. I wasn't imagining the tension anymore. It was there, illuminated plainly, refusing to be ignored. That night, I lay awake longer than I meant to, the house dark except for the faint glow leaking in from the porch. My mind kept returning to Lily's voice, steady and unflinching. It's not an accident anymore. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the quiet finally give shape to a truth I'd been tiptoeing around. This wasn't about food. It wasn't even about my stomach. It was about control disguised as care, about lines crossed gently enough that no one else noticed. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket to my chin. A thought surfaced, clearer than any other. If no one would see what I saw, then I needed proof. Real proof. Something undeniable. And for the first time in weeks, that thought steadied me rather than scared me. The next morning at work, while I was stirring powdered creamer into weak office coffee, one of my colleagues walked in beaming, holding up a tiny camera between her fingers. "Look what I got to spy on my dog when I'm gone," she laughed. The device was small, smaller than a thumb, and almost weightless. It blinked a soft blue light, subtle enough to disappear in a cluttered room. I held it for a moment, turning it over, feeling its smooth edges against my palm. Something in me clicked into place. Proof didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be seen. My coworker rambled about how it streams straight to her phone, how it picks up even the softest sounds. I wasn't fully listening anymore. I was imagining my kitchen counter, the quiet mornings, the space between someone's actions and their explanations. For once, the idea didn't feel paranoid. It felt rational. By lunch, I had already looked up models, specs, angles, battery life, my fingers moving with a kind of calm urgency I hadn't felt in weeks. Every product page made the knot in my chest loosen, not because I wanted to catch anyone, but because I was tired of doubting myself. If the world refused to believe me, then the camera could. It didn't have loyalties. It didn't excuse behavior. It observed. That alone gave me a strange sense of relief. A tool without emotion suddenly felt safer than the people who claimed to love me. I saved a few options, added one to my cart, and let myself breathe a little deeper. Action, even small action, felt like reclaiming something I didn't know I had lost, my own sense of authority over my life. That evening, after Jake went to bed early, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies each small decision. I scrolled through reviews, imagining hiding the camera behind the herb pots, tucked beside the pepper grinder, nestled between recipe books. I thought through angles, shadows, timing. I wasn't plotting. I was preparing. When I finally clicked purchase, the confirmation page glowed on the screen like a private vow. I reached into my drawer and slid the receipt into a folder labeled House, Safety. Naming it that felt oddly empowering, like acknowledging the truth of why I needed it. My hand lingered on the folder a moment longer before I closed everything down. I didn't tell Jake. I couldn't. Not yet. He would think I was escalating things unnecessarily, turning family attention into a case. He'd try to talk me down gently, kindly, with that tone he uses for fragile things, not realizing I wasn't the fragile one here. The idea of disappointing him stung, but the idea of staying powerless stung more. Some truths, I realized, are too sharp to share before you're ready. So I held the secret quietly. The house felt different that night, as though the walls themselves were waiting with me. My thoughts drifted toward what might happen when the camera arrived, what I might see or not see. Either possibility felt like a reckoning. Before bed, I walked into the kitchen and stood at the counter where all of this had begun. The unopened bento from earlier sat beside the fruit bowl, resting innocently in the dim light. I reached out and touched the lid. My fingertips pressed lightly against its cool surface, not in fear this time, but in promise. I whispered to myself, not dramatic, not emotional, just factual. Next time, I'll know. The refrigerator hummed softly, filling the silence. It wasn't courage I felt. It wasn't anger either. It was clarity, steady and quiet, settling into my bones like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Upstairs, I slipped under the blankets beside Jake, who was already asleep. His breath was soft, even, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I watched him for a moment, wondering when I'd started carrying this alone. But then another thought surfaced, clearer than the rest. I wasn't alone anymore, not with what I planned. I didn't need Jake to believe me yet. I needed truth, the kind you can replay, the kind that doesn't shift under someone else's narrative. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the coming days settle around me. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be gaslit by my own hope again. I would let the lens see what I could not. The camera arrived on a quiet Saturday morning, tucked inside a small brown package that barely weighed anything. I carried it into the kitchen like it was something fragile, though the object itself was simple, just a small black square with a faint lens glimmering at the corner. I tested it first by placing it in my palm and pointing it toward the living room. The image streamed onto my phone with startling clarity, catching every detail. The soft crease in the couch cushions, the dust floating through a beam of light. After adjusting the settings, I hid it inside the pot of red geraniums on the counter, angling it toward the workspace Marion always gravitated to. From the doorway, the pot looked exactly the same, just a plant in sunlight. The camera blended into the shadows like it had always belonged there. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of anticipation settle into my chest. I spent a few minutes recording test footage, listening to the faint clink of utensils captured through the microphone. The ordinary sounds of my kitchen felt different now, sharper, almost amplified, as if the room understood what was coming. Watching the test clips on my phone made me feel steadier, like I had a witness on standby. I deleted the practice footage, closed the app, and let myself imagine the moment when the truth, whatever it was, would finally have a shape. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. The fear that had trailed me for weeks had thinned into something quieter, something resolute. I wasn't hunting for wrongdoing. I was done depending on trust that hadn't been earned. Evidence didn't lie. People did, sometimes without even realizing it. The next day, I called Marion in a tone purposely light, telling her I needed help prepping some meals for the week. She sounded delighted, too delighted, as if she had been waiting for an invitation she knew would come. An hour later, she arrived with her tote bag, stepping into the house like it was her stage. "I'll make something simple for you," she said, already moving toward the counter without waiting for direction. I stood near the sink, steadying my breath, pretending to scroll on my phone while the camera quietly recorded every inch of her motion. My posture felt rigid, but I kept my face neutral. This had to look natural. The moment she unpacked her containers and jars, I felt a faint chill slip down my spine. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was holding its breath. From my angle near the doorway, I watched her open her tote. Among the spices and neatly folded towels, she pulled out a small jar labeled as fertilizer. Brown, grainy, unremarkable to an uninformed eye. But I had seen enough in the last few weeks to notice the details. The tiny dried specks inside, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. She placed the jar at the corner of the counter, almost casually. Then she opened the bento box she had brought, humming softly under her breath. Her movements were confident, practiced, like someone replaying a ritual they had performed many times before. Each gesture felt deliberate. I watched her spoon ingredients into the box, my heart pounding slowly, not with fear, but with certainty. The kitchen lights glowed warm above her, illuminating the exact spot where the box sat, right in the center of the camera's frame. For a split second, the reflected gleam from the surface of the container flashed across my phone screen, confirming the angle was perfect.
As Marian leaned over the counter, I saw the faintest glimmer from the camera lens reflected in her glasses. So subtle she didn't notice. Her shoulders relaxed, and she continued assembling the meal, unaware she wasn't alone in the room. I kept my phone angled away from her, pretending to check messages. But the tiny stream of live footage at the corner of the screen made my pulse thrum with a strange mix of dread and relief. Whatever happened, there would be no more ambiguity. I stepped back, out of the camera's field of view, leaving Marian fully framed. She hummed a tune I didn't recognize, completely at ease.
Watching her from a distance, I realized I was witnessing two performances at once. The version she wanted me to see, and the version the camera would remember. She reached for the jar again, her hand moving with unsettling familiarity. I held my breath, my back pressed lightly against the wall, afraid even the sound of my inhale would interrupt what was unfolding. I didn't speak. I didn't intervene. I just watched, calm, still, waiting for her to reveal herself without knowing she was being seen. For the first time in weeks, the fear inside me dissolved into something firmer. Resolve. From the hallway, I heard her mutter under her breath, a low, irritated whisper that didn't match the careful smile she reserved for me. "Let's see if she can handle this one," she said, barely audible, but sharp enough to slice clean through the quiet. My spine went rigid. The words felt rehearsed, like something she'd said more than once. I held my phone tighter, the live feed streaming her every movement in steady detail. The air in the house felt thin, stripped of pretense. Until that moment, I had still clung to a small thread of possibility, however frayed, that maybe I'd been wrong. Hearing her voice shaped into intention snapped the last piece of denial clean in half. For a brief second, the world seemed to tilt, not violently, but with a quiet slide, as though the truth had been waiting all along, just out of sight. Through the doorway, I watched as she opened the jar again, the dried fragments inside shifting like tiny bones. Her hands moved with brisk confidence. She spooned out one small insect, its stiff form unmistakable even from where I stood, and tucked it along the edge of the rice. No hesitation, no disgust, no second thoughts. She pressed the grains over it with her thumb, smoothing the surface as though hiding a message only she understood. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't clumsiness or bad luck. It was deliberate, practiced, almost methodical. The camera captured everything. The tilt of her wrist, the way she checked her work, the small exhale of satisfaction afterward. I stared at the image on my screen, the reality undeniable, crisp and cold. When she finished packing the box, she lifted it to her face and smiled, an expression I had never seen aimed at me, only at the food she expected me to eat. It wasn't maternal pride. It was something else, something quieter and darker, like she had solved a problem only she understood. She snapped the lid shut with a practiced click, gave the box a little shake, and murmured, "Good enough." Watching from afar, I felt something inside me detach gently, like a knot untying. I had spent weeks doubting myself, bending my body and mind around politeness, loyalty, and fear of misunderstanding. But there, in the center of my kitchen, was the truth, unfiltered, unarguable. No more guessing, no more guilt for feeling unsafe. My breath steadied, lower and deeper than it had in days. I stepped into the kitchen just as she placed the bento neatly on the counter, wiping her hands on a towel with a satisfied air. "You work too much," she said when she noticed me, her voice smooth, sweetened with the same false gentleness she always used. "I thought I'd help you get ahead for the week." I matched her expression, calm and warm, as though we were playing roles in a scene we'd both memorized. "You're very thoughtful," I replied. The words tasted strange, but my voice didn't betray me. She handed me the box like an offering, her eyes fixed on my face with a searching intensity, as if measuring whether I would eat it here and now. I accepted it with steady hands, though a storm of clarity burned beneath my skin. She lingered a moment longer, adjusting a stray dish towel, glancing at the trash can, scanning the counters the way a teacher scans a classroom. Then, in a voice so casual it almost slipped past me, she said, "Make sure you don't waste this one." I nodded as if the request were benign, but inside something hardened. Her tone was sweet, but the command underneath was unmistakable. She didn't want to feed me. She wanted to monitor me, measure me, correct me. The room felt smaller, the air slightly heavier. Yet for the first time, I wasn't afraid of her expectations. I wasn't even afraid of her intentions. I knew something she didn't, that her performance had been recorded from the moment she stepped into my kitchen. I walked her to the door, the bento box balanced lightly in my hands. She smiled as she left, unaware of the camera still blinking quietly behind the geranium leaves. When the door clicked shut, the house exhaled, and so did I. I set the box down on the table, not with disgust, but with a strange calm. I wasn't holding a meal. I was holding evidence. The object that had humiliated me for weeks had finally become the thing that vindicated me. I turned to look at the kitchen. Same shapes, same shadows, but everything felt newly exposed, as if a layer of fog had lifted. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a video file, waiting on my phone, waiting to rewrite everything. After Marion left, I locked the door with a steadiness that surprised me. The house felt unnaturally quiet, like the rooms themselves were bracing for whatever came next. I set the bento on the counter, washed my hands out of habit, then took my phone to the dining table. My fingers hovered over the app for a moment, as though opening it would alter something irreversible in my life. Then I tapped it. The footage loaded instantly, Marion's shape emerging from the frame, familiar yet suddenly foreign. I watched her walk into my kitchen with the confidence of someone entering their own territory. My hands began to tremble, but only slightly, the way they do when truth is about to land. I leaned forward, bracing my elbows against the table, prepared but not ready. The video unfolded with clinical precision. Every movement she made felt magnified under the unblinking lens. She placed her tote down, pulled out the jar, murmured to herself. I watched the way she handled the food, carefully, almost lovingly, until the moment she reached for the dried insect. That single gesture ruptured the entire narrative I had been taught to believe about her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't recoil. She didn't even look around to check if anyone might walk in. It was routine, almost intimate in its familiarity. Seeing it from the camera's perspective stripped away every excuse I had tried to make on her behalf. There was no miscommunication, no misunderstanding, just intention. I paused the video at the exact moment her thumb pressed the grains of rice over the insect. The still image was stark, her hand poised in midair, her expression calm, the kitchen bathed in warm afternoon light. The contrast unsettled me more than any dramatic action could have. It was the mundanity that horrified me. This wasn't a burst of anger or a lapse in judgment. It was a quiet, practiced cruelty done with the ease of habit. I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs before releasing it in a long, steady exhale. My stomach didn't twist the way I expected. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, cold but steady. Truth, when finally revealed, has a way of silencing every competing noise. I pressed play again, watching as she closed the lid and smiled to herself, a small, private smile that told me everything I needed to know. She carried the box toward the sink, adjusting her hair in the reflection of the microwave door. For a moment, she looked almost proud, like a professor finishing a lesson. Then she placed the box neatly on the counter, exactly where she knew I would see it. I let the video play through to the end, where she wiped the counter, straightened a dish towel, and left the kitchen with the same unhurried confidence she arrived with. When the screen went black, the silence that followed felt heavy enough to reshape the entire room. I renamed the file carefully, fingers steady as I typed the date and her name. The action felt strangely ceremonial, like labeling something sacred or dangerous. Then, I backed it up to the cloud in 3 separate folders, each one a layer of protection I hadn't realized I needed. As the upload bar crawled forward, I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. I expected tears, or rage, or even nausea. But instead, I felt an unexpected clarity. A line had been crossed long before today. I was only now acknowledging it. I whispered to the empty room, "No one gets to use my body as a lesson." And hearing my own voice say it made the truth settle deeper. When I finally stood, the kitchen felt unfamiliar, as though I were seeing it from a new vantage point. I rested my hand lightly on the back of a chair, letting the stillness anchor me. I wasn't afraid of Marian anymore. Fear thrives in ambiguity. Truth extinguishes it. What I felt now was something different, an internal pivot, a quiet shift from defense to authority. The evidence was real. The story had changed. And I knew the days ahead would require more than composure. They would require resolve. I looked at the counter where the bento sat, then at the camera hidden behind the geraniums. "This ends now," I murmured, not with anger, but with absolute certainty. That night, after hours of pacing the house in near silence, I sent Lily a brief message. "Can you come over? I need you to see something." She arrived with her hair still damp from a shower, wearing loose sweats and carrying the calm presence I had come to rely on. I didn't offer tea or small talk. Instead, I placed my phone on the coffee table and opened the video. "Just watch," I said. The room dimmed around us as the footage began, the only light coming from the small screen between us. I didn't look at Lily. I watched the reflection of her reaction in the darkened window. Her face tightened as the seconds passed, her brows knitting, jaw setting. When the sound of Marian's muttered comment drifted through the speaker, Lily drew in a sharp breath. She didn't interrupt. She watched all the way to the end, the silence stretching like a held note. When the footage finally ended, Lily leaned back slowly, her arms crossing in that instinctive protective way nurses have when absorbing something heavy. "Emma," she said, voice low but unwavering, "this isn't overreacting. This isn't misunderstanding. This is harm." The word echoed inside me like a stone dropped into deep water. She didn't soften it. She didn't tiptoe around it. She named it because it needed to be named. I felt something in me unravel, not in panic, but in recognition. It's jarring how validation can feel both like relief and grief at the same time. Lily reached forward, touched my hand lightly, and added, "You don't have to downplay any of this. What she's doing is real." For the first time in weeks, I didn't argue with the truth. She advised me to document everything: dates, symptoms, messages, videos. "Treat this like you would treat any ongoing harm," she said, "because that's what it is." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, steady, grounded in experience. She talked about counseling resources, about boundaries, about the ways subtle behavior can escalate if never confronted. I listened quietly, absorbing each word with a clarity I hadn't had before. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a plan for safety, for reclaiming space in my own life. I nodded as she spoke, the calmness in her voice threading itself into my spine, making me sit straighter. It wasn't courage that filled me, just the acceptance that pretending nothing was wrong had become impossible. When I walked her to the door afterward, the porch lights flicked on, spilling warm gold across the walkway. The evening air smelled faintly of pine mulch and someone's distant barbecue. It should have been an ordinary neighborhood night, but it felt different, too quiet, too reflective. Lily paused on the steps, looked back at me and said, "You are not imagining this. You are not being dramatic, and you don't owe her your silence." Her words settled on my shoulders like a blanket I didn't realize I'd needed. I watched her walk down the path, her figure disappearing into the rows of identical townhouses. The lights blinked off after she left, leaving only the soft darkness of the street. I stood there a moment longer, breathing in the cool air, letting the truth settle deeper. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table again, opening my notebook with a different mindset. The lines I wrote now felt steadier, less frantic. Day 57. Reviewed footage. Showed to Lily. Classified pattern. Repeated. Intentional. I wrote the words without trembling. They didn't feel dramatic. They felt accurate. I copied timestamps. I noted the physical symptoms. I transcribed Marian's muttered comment. This wasn't paranoia. This was record-keeping. A ledger of reality. When I finished writing, I closed the notebook gently, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. The order of it soothed me. It reminded me that clarity is its own kind of protection, even when the truth is painful. Before heading upstairs, I played the video once more, not to torture myself, but to strip away the last layer of disbelief that occasionally tried to resurface. This time, my eyes didn't widen, my breath didn't hitch. I simply watched. At the end, I whispered to myself, "No more excuses." The room didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt honest. I turned off the lights, letting the gentle hum of the refrigerator fill the silence. As I climbed the stairs, a strange steadiness followed me. Quiet, grounded, resolute. I wasn't sure what the next step would look like, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The truth wasn't something I needed permission to stand on. It was already mine. The next morning, I sent Marian a short text, asking if she could come over to talk about my health. No accusations, no tension in the words. Just enough concern to make it believable. She replied within minutes. "Of course, dear." The sweetness heavy enough to leave a film on the screen. When she arrived that afternoon, she carried another grocery bag, like she couldn't enter a house without offering food. I guided her into the kitchen, its quiet afternoon light stretching across the counters in pale rectangles. "Sit," I said gently, motioning toward the table where 2 cups of tea were already waiting. She lowered herself into the chair, smoothing her skirt, her expression open but watchful. There was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, as if she sensed something was coming but believed she could control the narrative once she heard it. I sat across from her, my phone turned face down on the table, screen dim but ready. The ticking of the wall clock sounded louder than usual, filling the silence between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the heat soak into my palms. "I've been having stomach problems," I began calmly. "For weeks now." Marian's face softened theatrically, the kind of sympathy she wore like an accessory. "Oh, sweetheart, why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, leaning forward. I held her gaze, steady and unblinking. "I'm telling you now," I said. She didn't realize yet that I wasn't asking for comfort or explanation. I was laying out the groundwork for a truth she wouldn't be able to sidestep. I recounted everything in a measured tone. The sour smell, the afternoon cramps, the day with the insect, and how humiliating it had felt. Not a single accusation, just facts, delivered quietly. Marian's smile tightened. "You think I caused that?" she asked, her voice pitched in wounded incredulity. It was a performance I had seen before, polished and rehearsed. I didn't bite. "I'm not saying anything yet," I replied. "I'm just telling you what I've been experiencing." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the mask slipping for a breath before she recovered. "Sometimes our minds can make things bigger than they are," she said, patting her teacup, "especially when stress is involved." Her tone was gentle, coaxing, almost maternal. If I hadn't seen the footage, I might have folded under it. I waited for the right moment, one heartbeat, then another, and then turned my phone over, tapping the screen without breaking eye contact. The video began to play, its sound rising softly between us. The familiar image filled the screen. My kitchen, her hands, the jar. Marian paused mid-sip, the cup hovering near her lips. The color drained from her face as her own voice, recorded without her knowledge, murmured through the speaker. She froze, eyes locked on the footage. Her hand trembled, barely noticeable but unmistakable. She set the cup down slowly, as though any sudden movement might shatter the moment. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us, the air thickening as the truth she thought would stay hidden played out in clinical detail. When the video ended, Marian's denial came quickly, too quickly. I was joking, she said, voice taut, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. You're misunderstanding everything. She tried to laugh, but the sound was brittle, unconvincing. Bugs get into food sometimes. You can't... I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Please don't insult me by pretending I didn't see what I just saw. My tone wasn't angry. It was tired, steady, final. She blinked rapidly, as if searching for a version of events she could still control. Her mouth opened, then closed. The facade she'd always worn, competence, sweetness, martyrdom, cracked at the edges. Her eyes drifted to the phone again, the silence between us colder now, stripped of pretense. She gripped the warm teacup as though it were an anchor. You don't understand what it's like, she whispered, her voice no longer smooth but trembling. I did everything alone. Everything. And now I'm supposed to sit back and watch... She stopped, biting down on the last words. I let the confession hang, not rescuing her from it. I'm not here to debate your past, I said softly. I'm here to make sure my future isn't endangered by it. She looked smaller suddenly, her certainty shrinking in the glow of hard evidence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking clock filled the room again, steady and indifferent. I folded my hands in my lap, breathing slowly. Whatever happened next, the truth was no longer hers to manipulate. It finally belonged to me. Marian recovered quickly. At least, she tried to. Her spine straightened, and she forced a strained little smile that didn't reach her eyes. I was exaggerating. It was supposed to be funny, she insisted, waving a dismissive hand at the paused video on my phone. But her gaze flickered, revealing the fracture beneath the performance. You know how these cameras can distort things, she added, the words too hurried, too desperate. I watched her talk in circles, her sentences tripping over each other, as though she hoped sheer volume could drown out the evidence. But the kitchen didn't soften around her. The light didn't shift in her favor. The truth had too much gravity now. I could see her mind scrambling, calculating, searching for a new story to replace the one unraveling in front of us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply repeated the facts she kept trying to bend. You put something in my food, more than once. My voice was steady, almost quiet enough to sound gentle, but there was no softness in the meaning. Marian flinched at the phrasing, as though hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly undeniable. She leaned back in her chair, gripping the arms like she needed the support. I was under pressure, she muttered. You think you know everything, but you're still young. You don't understand what families are like. I felt a faint ache rise, but not from guilt. From the way she used the word family like a shield, a justification for anything. Families don't require your body as collateral, I said. She looked away, her tone sharpened, turning from defensive to accusatory. I raised Jake alone. I fought for everything he has. And now you come along and twist innocent gestures into this. She gestured wildly at the phone. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. For a moment I glimpsed something buried. Years of resentment, fear of losing relevance, anger carved into her bones. You're making me into some kind of villain, she added, trembling. I exhaled slowly, keeping my own voice measured. I'm not making you anything. You did what you did. The truth sat between us like a third person at the table, one Marian could no longer talk over. Her lips pressed together, thinning into a hard line, and I realized she wasn't just afraid of what I'd seen. She was afraid of what it meant for the hierarchy she'd spent decades crafting. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. Do you know what it feels like to have someone look at your food and not trust you? To feel like everything you do is being judged? For a brief moment, her mask slipped far enough for me to see the wound beneath it. She'd spent years tying her worth to caretaking, to control disguised as generosity. And the moment that control was threatened, she snapped the only way she knew how, by trying to reassert dominance. Maybe you should ask yourself why you need people to be sick to feel needed, I said gently. She flinched, as though the words had struck flesh. She opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again, but no coherent reply came. Her certainty, once impenetrable, was unraveling thread by thread. Then came the plea wrapped in accusation. You won't show this to anyone, will you? Her voice shook as she finally touched the fear she'd been dodging. Not fear for me, not fear for Jake, fear for herself, her image, her pride, her standing in the quiet hierarchy of family and neighborhood gossip. I don't want to be humiliated, she whispered. Her eyes glistened, not with remorse, but with panic over being exposed. I let the silence hang long enough for her to feel the weight of the question. I don't want to hurt you, I said, but I won't let this continue. Her breath hitched. She knew what that meant. I wasn't promising secrecy. I was promising boundaries. And to someone who'd spent her life breaching them, that was the sharper threat. She leaned forward, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Tell me what you want, she whispered. For a moment, she looked less like the woman who had orchestrated quiet harm and more like someone trapped in her own unresolved past, repeating patterns she never questioned. I took a breath, studying myself. I want this to stop, I said. No more food I didn't ask for. No more pressure. No more pretending things are fine while you endanger me. She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling, knuckles pale. The kitchen clock clicked on, marking the shift in the air. For the first time, Marian didn't look like an adversary or an authority. She looked like someone finally forced to face herself and losing her footing. I took a slow breath before speaking, choosing each word with intention. From now on, I said, keeping my tone level, no more food that's meant for me alone. If you want to cook, we all eat it together, here, where everyone sees what goes into it. Marian blinked, startled by the simplicity of the rule. She opened her mouth, but no objection came out. I continued. And you don't come into this kitchen unless I'm home. No more letting yourself in while I'm at work. Her expression tightened, the shift subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't used to boundaries that didn't leave space for negotiation. The kitchen felt full of her pride, my resolve, the unspoken understanding that something fundamental had just shifted. I wasn't asking. I was defining the terms of my own safety. Marian's voice cracked with bitterness. So that's it? I'm an outsider now? She said, attempting to sound wounded, but the edge beneath the words gave her away. I shook my head. If I saw you as an outsider, I wouldn't bother having this conversation. I would have walked away. She looked down, jaw tightening, fingers picking at the hem of her sleeve. My tone softened, but only slightly. I'm doing this because I want peace, and peace doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. Her eyes flicked toward my phone, then back to me, the truth still raw in the air between us. For once, she didn't try to twist my words. Something in her understood that the old dynamic, her control, my silence, would no longer hold. She grasped for moral high ground, even as it slipped beneath her. You're going to tell Jake, she said, more statement than question. Her voice carried both fear and accusation. I nodded. If this continues, yes. And if I need to show him, I will. Her breath stuttered. The idea of her son seeing her actions, the quiet cruelty behind the hospitality she worshipped, shook her more than any confrontation with me. "He won't understand," she whispered. "He thinks I'm good." I held her gaze steadily. People can be good in some ways and harmful in others. Both can be true. Her face hardened, softening again a second later, as though she couldn't decide which version of herself to be. She had always relied on her sacrifices as justification. Now that equation no longer worked. Her next question came sharp, defensive. "Are you going to drag me in front of counselors or lawyers?" The word drag carried a lifetime of resentment, as if the real danger wasn't her actions, but the possibility of being held accountable for them. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not trying to punish you. I am trying to make it clear that if this behavior continues, I will protect myself. That might mean involving other people." She swallowed hard, the muscle in her jaw twitching. She wasn't used to dealing with consequences without disguise. She shifted in her chair, looking smaller now, like someone pulled out of a role they depended on. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, uncaring, marking each second of her unraveling. Marian exhaled shakily, her eyes glistening not with remorse but with fear, the kind born from imagining her image collapsing in front of others. "I don't want this becoming public," she whispered. "I've already lived through enough shame in my life." Her voice trembled at the edges, cracking slightly as she spoke. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to sit with the weight of her own words. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of being unmasked. Finally, I said, "Then don't put me in a position where I have to show people the truth." She closed her eyes briefly, the line landing harder than anything else I'd said. Not a threat, a boundary. Firm, real, unavoidable. For the first time since this began, I felt a strange, unexpected empathy flicker. Not forgiveness, not softness, but recognition. Marian wasn't a monster. She was a woman shaped by her own old wounds, repeating patterns she'd never questioned. But understanding her past didn't mean surrendering my present. "I don't want to destroy you," I said quietly. "I just want safety, respect, basic dignity." Her shoulders sagged under the truth. She looked down at her hands, frail in the afternoon light, and nodded once. Barely perceptible, but real. Not agreement, not apology, just acknowledgement that the world she built was no longer the only one that mattered. I stood, letting the silence settle around us. The line had been drawn, and for the first time, she saw it. The days after the confrontation moved strangely, slow in feeling, fast in form. Marian kept her distance, sending only brief texts to Jake, never to me. The silence in the house felt different now, less suffocating but still weighted, like air after a storm that hasn't fully passed. Jake sensed something was off. He noticed the careful calm in my voice, the way I avoided the kitchen when certain topics surfaced. One night, as he stood by the doorway watching me fold laundry with unusual precision, he finally said, "Emma, are you okay?" I looked up, studying the worry in his face, and realized I had spent so long protecting him from the truth that I had blurred the line between kindness and erasure. It was time, past time, for him to see the reality I'd been carrying alone. I told him we needed to talk, and he followed me into the kitchen, the one place that had become a map of everything unspoken. I placed my phone on the counter and tapped the screen, letting the video load. "Before I say anything," I said, "I need you to watch this." Jake frowned, confused but willing, and leaned against the counter as the footage began. He didn't move for the first few seconds. Then his posture stiffened. His breath hitched. His brows drew together in disbelief. I stood a few feet away, watching him instead of the video. Watching the moment recognition pierced through his loyalty. The moment denial could no longer protect either of us. He replayed the clip twice without speaking. The room felt colder with each pass. When the video ended, Jake set the phone down slowly, as if it weighed more than it should. That's my mom's voice," he said, his tone thin and shaken. He ran a hand over his face, eyes distant, as if trying to reconcile two images of the same woman. She wouldn't... He stopped mid-sentence, unable to finish a thought that no longer held. The silence that followed was thick with the collapse of old assumptions. I didn't interrupt. I didn't comfort. I let him sit in the truth, the way I had sat in it alone for days. Finally, he whispered, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" There was no accusation, just heartbreak. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," I said quietly, and I wasn't ready to be disbelieved again. Jake turned toward the window, his reflection fractured across the glass. He tapped his fingers against the sill, a small, restless rhythm that betrayed his inner turmoil. "She always cooked out of love," he murmured. "She said it was how she took care of people." I nodded. "Love can't justify hurting someone," I replied. "And care isn't real if it demands your silence." He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The porch light flicked on outside, washing his face in a soft amber glow. The image of him standing there, caught between the safety of what he believed and the danger of what he now knew, felt like a turning point for both of us. He wasn't choosing between her and me. He was choosing between illusion and truth. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, steadier. "I'm sorry I didn't see it," he said. "I wanted things to stay simple. I didn't want to believe anything that might make my mom look..." He trailed off again, shoulders tightening. I stepped closer. "You don't have to choose a villain," I said. "But you do have to acknowledge what happened." He nodded slowly, grief blooming behind his eyes. Not grief for what she had done, but for the version of her he was losing. "I won't pretend anymore," he said. "I won't protect her at the cost of your safety." The sentence landed softly, but the commitment inside it was solid. It felt like something inside him had finally aligned with something inside me. I moved closer, placing my hand lightly on the counter beside him. "I don't need you to fight her," I said. "I need you to stand with me in the truth." Jake turned toward me fully then, and the look in his eyes was no longer confused or defensive. It was resolute, anchored. "I'm with you," he said. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of a deeper understanding that had finally settled between us. The porch light outside glowed steadily, no longer a warning, but a witness. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground beneath our marriage shift, not in collapse, but in reconstruction. And I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. Jake left the house the next afternoon, with a heaviness in his shoulders I had never seen before. He didn't take the car, he walked, hands deep in his jacket pockets, head slightly bowed, like someone preparing for a conversation that would redraw the map of his life. I watched him from the window, my breath fogging the glass. I didn't follow. This was a road he needed to walk alone. The hours that followed moved quietly. I cleaned the kitchen, rearranged a few drawers, anything to keep my hands busy. The house felt strangely still, as if holding its breath alongside me. I wasn't worried about what he would say to Marion. I was worried about what she would say to him. The guilt, the theatrics, the history she carried like armor. Knowing the truth and accepting it were two different battles, and Jake was stepping into both. When he arrived at her house, he texted me once. "I'll talk to her." Then nothing. I imagined him standing in her living room, surrounded by framed photos of birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments curated to protect the illusion she had always lived behind. I pictured him holding his phone, showing her the footage, her face tightening, then breaking. The version of Marion he loved was built from decades of sacrifice, devotion, and a carefully crafted narrative about what a mother must endure. Confronting the darker version, the one capable of quiet harm, meant confronting his own blind spots. My chest tightened at the thought of him navigating that collision alone. But he needed to hear her without me as buffer. He needed to face the truth without my voice guiding him. Hours later he returned, shoulders tense but jaw set with a new kind of certainty. He placed his keys on the counter with deliberate quiet, like someone handling fragile glass. "She cried," he said simply. "Not the soft kind of crying that comes from remorse, the brittle kind that cracks under self-defense. She said she was stressed, said she didn't mean harm, said you misunderstood her." His eyes dimmed with the weight of it. "But then I showed her the part where she said, that line." He didn't repeat the words. He didn't need to. We both knew them by heart. His voice trembled just enough for me to hear how deeply the truth had cut. "And she had nothing left to say." For the first time, he wasn't protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. Jake sank into a kitchen chair, rubbing his palms together as if trying to warm them. "She kept saying she raised me alone, that I owe her, that you were taking me away from her." His voice quieted, turning inward. "It's like she couldn't separate care from control, love from possession." He swallowed, eyes clouding. "I didn't want to see it. I kept telling myself she was just intense. But this..." He paused, shaking his head. "This crossed a line I can't unsee." I sat across from him, letting the silence settle around us. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't reach for him. Some truths you have to sit with alone, even when someone else shares the room. He lifted his gaze to mine, the porch light outside reflecting in his eyes. "I'm not pretending this away," he said. "I'm not cushioning it for her anymore." There was grief in his voice. Grief for the version of his mother he was losing. Grief for the childhood narrative that was cracking open. Grief for the man he now realized he needed to become. "You didn't deserve any of this," he added, his voice softened, almost breaking. "And I'm sorry I made you feel like you were overreacting. I see it now." He wasn't offering excuses. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was finally standing in the truth with both feet, steady despite the tremor beneath him. I placed my hand on the table, not touching him, just close enough for him to reach if he needed to. "I don't need you to choose sides," I said softly. "I just need you to choose integrity." Jake nodded slowly, the weight in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "I can do that," he whispered. And for the first time, I believed him. The house felt different, lighter in some places, heavier in others. But the air between us had shifted, cleared of old illusions. We sat together in the dim kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Outside, the porch light glowed steady and warm, no longer a signal of intrusion or warning, just a quiet reminder that clarity, once found, doesn't fade. The next morning, the house felt different. Not peaceful, not tense, but suspended, like it was waiting for something to settle. Jake moved through the kitchen with a quiet deliberateness, rinsing his coffee mug twice, straightening a dish towel without thinking. He wasn't avoiding me. He was recalibrating. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders, in how carefully he breathed through each pause. Grief has a way of rearranging the air around a person, and he moved like someone learning to breathe in a world that no longer matched the one he grew up in. I leaned against the doorway, watching him for a moment, not out of suspicion, out of tenderness, for both of us. Truth, once exposed, doesn't just shift relationships. It shifts the spaces those relationships inhabit. Jake finally turned toward me, his mug cradled between his hands like an anchor. "I think she'll try to come over," he said. The resignation in his voice held no resentment, only clarity. "She'll want to rewrite everything. She always does." I nodded, understanding the pattern too well. "What do you want to do when she does?" I asked. He hesitated, then answered with a steadiness that surprised even him. "I want her to understand she can't step back into this house the same way she used to. I want her to respect the boundaries you set." He paused, exhaling slowly. "And I want her to face what she did, not spin it, not bury it, face it." The honesty in his voice felt like the first beam of light breaking through after weeks of fog. As if summoned by the conversation, a car rolled into the driveway. Slow, cautious. Marion's. Jake stiffened, the breath caught in his chest. I didn't move toward him or away. I simply stood still, allowing him space to decide who he wanted to be in the next 5 minutes. Footsteps approached the door, hesitant but familiar. Then came the soft knock. 2 taps, polite but loaded. Jake glanced at me, uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. But it didn't last. He set his mug down, straightened his posture, and walked to the door with the kind of quiet resolve people only find after breaking through their own illusions. When he opened it, the sunlight framed him in a thin, unsteady outline. Marion stood on the porch clutching a plastic container, the same brand she'd always used. She held it like a peace offering, or worse, a reset button. Her eyes darted toward me behind Jake, then back to him, her smile tight and trembling. "I made lunch for both of you," she said, but her voice had lost its old certainty. Jake didn't take the container. He didn't step aside to let her in. "Mom," he said, voice calm but unyielding. "We need to talk before anything else." The way her expression shifted, confusion, hurt, panic, was almost microscopic, but I caught every flicker. She had expected him to slip back into the role she had shaped for him his entire life. She hadn't prepared for this version. She tried first with softness. "Jake, sweetheart, you're still upset. I understand. But don't let her—" He cut her off gently but firmly. "This isn't about her controlling me. This is about what you did." His tone wasn't cold. It was honest in a way I'd never heard from him before. Marion blinked rapidly, gripping the container as though it might steady her. "I was overwhelmed," she whispered. "I didn't think—" Jake shook his head. "Mom, you didn't accidentally do any of that. We saw the footage. You did think. You just didn't think you'd ever be confronted." She flinched at the word footage, shame and disbelief battling across her face. For the first time, Jake wasn't cushioning her from accountability. The silence stretched long enough for the porch light to click off again, leaving the 3 of us in the soft shadow of midday. Marion finally lowered the container, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The image was almost surreal. This woman who had commanded rooms with her insistence, now looking small against the doorway of a home she no longer controlled. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly. Jake replied with a truth that settled into the air like something irrevocable. "You start by not pretending it didn't happen." She stared at him, realizing the ground beneath her had changed shape. And for the first time, she wasn't the one deciding where anyone stood. Marion stepped inside only when Jake gestured her to, but the way she crossed the threshold looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was still welcome. She set the untouched container on the console table without a word. Her eyes flicked around the living room, absorbing the new distance in the air. She wasn't entering her son's home like before, confident and claiming. She was entering a space that no longer bent around her comfort. She sat on the edge of the couch, spine stiff, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was honest. The kind of silence that makes people confront their own reflection. Jake sat beside her, but not close, his posture a boundary all on its own. I remained standing near the kitchen archway, not looming, just present. No longer the girl she thought she could dismiss. Marion looked up at Jake first. "I didn't mean for things to go so far," she murmured, voice thin with strain. "I was tired. I felt replaced. I thought if I could stay useful—" Her confession drifted into the air, small but piercing. She wasn't just defending herself now. She was exposing the insecurity underneath years of control. Jake let the words hang. He didn't rescue her. "Feeling replaced doesn't give you the right to hurt someone," he said, each word measured. "Especially someone who trusted you." Marion swallowed, the motion visible in her throat. For a brief moment, she seemed older, more fragile, not in body, but in the narrative she had wrapped herself in for years. It was unraveling thread by thread, leaving her exposed in ways she wasn't prepared for. Her eyes shifted toward me, finally acknowledging the weight of my place in the room. "I don't hate you," she said, though the sentence trembled, uncertain. "You were just changing everything, faster than I could adjust. I didn't know how to exist without being the one who keeps things together." I listened without stepping closer. "You don't have to hate me for me to be unsafe," I replied. "And I don't need you to disappear. But I do need you to stop trying to manage me." The word manage struck something in her. She flinched, like she'd been reading her own reflection through someone else's eyes. Jake watched us both, his silence steady, not passive but supportive. For once, the dynamic wasn't mother and son against the world. It was three adults finally facing the truth. Marian leaned forward, elbows on her knees, as though the weight of her own choices had finally settled. "I guess I didn't want to lose him," she whispered. "And you made him look at me differently." Her words weren't accusatory, they were mournful, almost childlike in their honesty. I felt a flicker of empathy, fleeting but real. "He didn't see the truth because it was hard," I said. "Not because I made it hard." She closed her eyes, letting the sentence land. The living room light softened around us, catching in the lines around her eyes. She wasn't a villain sitting there. She was a woman shaped by fear. Fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, fear of being replaced by someone younger and newer. But fear can't excuse harm, and she knew it now. She straightened, though her voice remained fragile. "What do I do now?" she asked Jake, because for the first time she didn't trust herself to decide. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair, the movement slow and deliberate. "You respect her boundaries," he said. "You stop coming unannounced. You stop giving food she never asked for. You stop trying to control situations so you can stay needed." Marian nodded, tears gathering along her lower lashes but not falling. She wasn't crying for sympathy. She was crying for a version of herself she didn't know how to reconcile with the truth on that video. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, grounding all three of us in the ordinariness of the moment. Jake continued, voice steady but not cruel. "And if you need help, real help, not control masked as help, you tell us. We'll be here. But this dynamic?" He shook his head. "It ends." Marian's breath trembled as she absorbed his words. She wasn't being cast out. She was being asked to grow. That, somehow, was harder for her to stomach. She looked between us, eyes softer, voice barely audible. "I will try." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first honest step she had offered. When she rose to leave, she paused at the door, touching the frame lightly as though anchoring herself. And for the first time since this began, she didn't look like a threat. She looked human, flawed, frightened, and beginning to understand the cost of truth. The door closed behind Marian with a soft click, leaving the house in a stillness that didn't feel empty, just unfamiliar. Jake and I stood there for a long moment, neither of us speaking, as though sound might break the fragile shift that had taken place. Eventually, he sat down on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he was trying to understand the world all over again. I joined him quietly, not touching him, not crowding him, just present. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds in thin lines, striping his face with alternating bands of brightness and shadow. Grief for a living parent has its own category, a grief that carries no rituals, no casseroles, no condolences from neighbors. It's the quiet ache of realizing a person you love is not the version you held in your mind. Jake rubbed his hands together slowly, the sounds soft but repetitive, like a grounding rhythm. "She looked lost," he said finally, "like she didn't know who she was without being in charge." I nodded. Losing control can feel like losing identity. He turned toward me, eyes tired but clearer than before. "You handled her with more grace than I ever could have." I shook my head. "I didn't handle her. I handled myself. That's all I can control." He let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in him for years. "Thank you," he whispered. Not for the video, not for the confrontation, but for naming the truth without weaponizing it. His gratitude was quiet, unembellished, and real. Over the next few days, the house settled into a new rhythm, one that felt sturdier underfoot. Marian didn't show up unannounced. She didn't call daily with updates or complaints or passive suggestions. She texted occasionally, short, tentative messages that read more like check-ins than demands. Jake replied with measured kindness, a boundary in every word. I felt the tension that had lived in my chest for weeks slowly unwind, like a knot loosening with each breath. Even the small things changed. The fruit bowl stayed full without being rearranged. The kitchen counters remained exactly as I left them. The air felt less claustrophobic. Sometimes healing isn't a dramatic reveal. It's simply the absence of the thing that kept you bracing. One evening, Jake asked if we could take a walk around the neighborhood. We walked side by side under the soft glow of the street lamps, our footsteps falling into a comfortable rhythm. The crickets hummed in the background, the night breeze carrying traces of cut grass and distant charcoal grills. It felt like reclaiming something, maybe us, maybe the air around us. "I'm scared of failing at this," he said quietly, "at being her son without letting her control me." I slipped my hands into my jacket pockets, letting the silence do some of the work. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," I said. "You just have to choose what's healthy over what's familiar." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the pavement as though reading something only he could see. When we got home, I checked the folder on my phone labeled House, Safety. The footage was still there, split into backups, untouched. I didn't watch it. I didn't need to. But I didn't delete it either. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. A record of what had happened wasn't a weapon. It was a reminder of my own boundaries, my own right to safety. Jake noticed the way I lingered on the file. "Do you want it gone?" he asked. I shook my head gently. "Not yet. Maybe one day. But right now, it's part of what helped me get here." He accepted that without pressing, the respect in his silence almost tender. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Jake turned toward me in the dim light. "I want to build something different with you," he said, "something not shaped by fear or guilt." His voice held no desperation, just quiet sincerity. I looked at him, seeing not the man caught between two loyalties, but the one who had chosen truth even when it hurt. "We already are," I said softly. Outside the window, the porch light glowed steadily, not a symbol of threat anymore, but of presence, of clarity, of a home finally shifting toward balance. And for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep without bracing for anything. A week later, Marian invited us to her house for dinner, an invitation so carefully worded it almost read like an apology. Jake read the message aloud while drying dishes, his brow furrowing slightly. "She says she wants to start over in a healthier way." The phrase sounded rehearsed but not manipulative, more like something she'd practiced in her head countless times before sending. I told him I needed a moment to think, not because I feared the food. The days since the confrontation had moved differently. Marian had been cautious, almost reverent with boundaries. Still, stepping into her space again meant confronting an older version of myself, the one who had ignored instincts, excused discomfort, softened truths. I leaned against the counter, feeling the familiar weight settle in my ribs. Growth can be exhausting, even when it's right. Jake watched me, his expression open, steady. "We don't have to go," he said. "Not unless you want to." The freedom in that sentence felt new, unexpected. I considered the invitation again, not the act of eating her food, which I had no intention of doing, but the act of occupying space with her under new terms. If we go, I said slowly, it has to be different. I'm not pretending anymore. Jake nodded. Then we go on your terms. His voice carried no hesitation. The gentleness in it didn't feel patronizing. It felt collaborative. There was a time when he would have insisted we keep the peace at all costs.
Now he understood that peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's just delayed harm wearing a polite mask. We arrived at Marian's house early evening, the sky a muted blue, the air thick with the smell of fresh rain. She opened the door quickly, almost nervously, as if worried we'd turn away at the last second. Her eyes softened when she saw us, though the old certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside. Inside, the table was set neatly, but there was one notable change. Everything on it was unopened, store-bought food, each item sealed in clear plastic containers. She had even kept the labels on. It was a gesture halfway between apology and accountability, a way of saying, I know you need transparency, and I'm willing to give it. The effort mattered more than the meal itself. Conversation started slowly, like someone learning to speak again after a long silence. Marian asked about work, about the weather, about the neighbor's new dog, surface-level things, safe things. She kept glancing at the table, as if the sealed packages were a constant reminder of the boundaries she was trying to honor. Jake answered her gently, but without slipping into old patterns. He didn't soothe her anxieties with overcompensation. He didn't translate my silences into excuses. He let the space be honest, even when it felt awkward. For the first time, I saw him as someone standing beside me, not between us. And oddly, that shift made it easier to breathe. At one point, Marian looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not sympathy, not resentment, but something in between. I know I can't undo what happened, she said quietly, but I'm trying. Her voice didn't tremble this time. It held a fragile steadiness, like someone stepping onto new terrain. I nodded, the gesture small but sincere. Trying matters, I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. She took a slow breath, then pushed a sealed fruit bowl closer to the center of the table, as if to show she understood the rules now. The gesture wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate, and in its smallness, it felt honest. When we left later that evening, the air outside was cool and faintly sweet, the streetlights glowing like distant lanterns. As Jake locked the car, he asked softly, "How do you feel?" I looked back at Marian's window, the soft light inside her house, the silhouette of her moving slowly through her living room. Like something has shifted, I said. Not fixed, but shifted. Jake reached for my hand, not to guide, not to reassure, but simply to be beside me. We drove home in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't hide anything. The porch light glowed when we arrived, steady and warm. And for the first time, stepping inside didn't feel like bracing. It felt like arriving. Life didn't snap back into place after that dinner. It stretched, reshaped itself slowly, like a joint learning to move again after a long injury. Some mornings I still woke up with a faint tension in my ribs, half expecting the old dynamics to return. But they didn't. Instead, the days took on a quiet steadiness. Jake checked in with me more, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. We moved through the house like two people reacquainting themselves with space they'd always shared, but never fully inhabited together. Small rituals formed, brewing coffee side by side, folding laundry together, stepping into conversations with more honesty than ease. The softness between us wasn't fragile anymore. It was intentional, earned. And I realized something subtle but significant. Trust rebuilds not in grand gestures, but in thousands of tiny choices made without fanfare. Marian texted every few days, not long messages, just brief notes that sounded carefully constructed. Thinking of you both. Saw this article about plant care.
Hope work isn't too stressful. They were neutral, almost stiff, as though she was learning how to speak a new emotional language. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't, and she didn't push. That in itself felt like progress. One afternoon, she sent a picture of a book titled Healthy Boundaries, Healthy Relationships. It was sitting on her coffee table, still wrapped in the bookstore's thin paper band. She didn't caption it. She didn't need to. The photo wasn't a plea. It wasn't manipulation. It was an attempt. A tentative one, but real. And for the first time, I didn't feel a reflexive tightening in my chest when her name lit up my phone. Jake found the courage to visit her alone again. Not to confront, not to soothe, but simply to see her. When he came back, he told me she'd been quieter, slower with her words. "She asked about you first," he said. "Not in a pointed way, just genuinely." He said she had made tea, but left the cups on the table unopened, waiting for him to pour his own, as if the act of not controlling something was her way of practicing restraint. "It felt different," he said, "like she's trying to relearn the world." I listened, absorbing each detail, letting them settle at their own pace. Healing doesn't always look like redemption. Sometimes, it's just an old pattern stuttering in a new direction. Meanwhile, I found myself checking the folder on my phone less and less. The footage remained, tucked away like a scar, evidence of something that once cut deep, but no longer dictated my days. I didn't feel tempted to replay it anymore. I didn't need the reminder of what had been done. The memory alone was enough to keep my boundaries intact. One crisp morning, after watering the plants, I stood by the geranium pot where the camera had once hidden. The soil had shifted slightly, the leaves extending toward the light, as if unaware of the role they once played in exposing the truth. I traced a fingertip over the rim of the pot, feeling a quiet gratitude, not for what happened, but for what it revealed. In the evenings, Jake and I talked more openly than we had in years, about the past, about how fear disguises itself, about how love can twist into something unrecognizable if no one calls it back to shape. He admitted he had spent a lifetime believing conflict was something to smooth over, not explore. I admitted I had spent too long giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when it hurt. There was no blame between us, only the slow, careful stitching of two people learning how to face discomfort together instead of alone. And in those conversations, something else took root. A recognition that this ordeal, as painful as it was, had forced us to grow in ways comfort never could. Late one night, while closing the curtains, I paused and looked out at the street, the soft wash of the porch light glowing against the quiet neighborhood. For so long, that light had felt like a warning, a flicker of unease threading through my evenings. Now it looked different, steady, warm, like a beacon marking a house where truth had finally found room to breathe. "We're getting better," Jake said behind me, his voice gentle as he wrapped an arm around my waist. I nodded, leaning into him. "We are. Not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly. And in that honesty, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Safety that wasn't dependent on vigilance, but on mutual clarity. It was the beginning of something sturdier than fear." Spring arrived slowly that year, drifting into the neighborhood in soft breaths rather than sudden declarations. One Saturday morning, I stood on the porch with a mug of tea, watching small petals scatter down the sidewalk like misplaced confetti. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and warm sunlight. Jake stepped beside me, stretching his arms after a long week, and for a moment we simply existed together, quiet, steady, unguarded. There was no tension humming beneath the surface, no unspoken dread shadowing the kitchen, only the gentle awareness of how far we had come. Healing doesn't announce itself, it appears in the ordinary, in the way your shoulders lower without you noticing, in the way silence stops feeling like the beginning of collapse and starts feeling like home again. Marian visited a few days later, but she texted first,
asking if she could stop by with groceries she bought for herself, not for us. The distinction mattered. When she arrived, she didn't step inside immediately. She stood on the porch, clutching a reusable bag, waiting for permission. It wasn't fear, it was respect. I opened the door and stepped aside, but she hesitated. "I can leave these here," she said softly. "No pressure." Her voice held none of its old certainty, none of its veiled expectations. I nodded toward the kitchen. "It's okay. Come in." She entered carefully, scanning the space with a gentler gaze than I'd ever seen. Not assessing, not claiming, just noticing. For the first time, I didn't brace. She placed her groceries on the counter, unsnapped the bag, and took a small breath before speaking. "I'm going to a support group," she said, "for boundary issues and family patterns." She said the words like they tasted unfamiliar, but she didn't look away. I exhaled slowly, surprised by the flicker of something warm in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement of effort. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Her shoulders softened, loosening a tension she had carried like bone. She didn't apologize again. She didn't relitigate the past. She simply stood there in her own humanity, flawed, frightened, trying. And I realized something quietly profound. Growth doesn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes it's just someone trying to unlearn a lifetime. Jake joined us, leaning casually against the counter, and Marion's expression shifted, wistful, proud, a little uncertain. "I'm learning I can love without controlling everything," she said. "It's harder than I thought." Jake reached for her hand, not to comfort her out of guilt, but to meet her halfway. "Trying is enough," he murmured. The simplicity of his words, the steadiness behind them, created a strange sense of symmetry. Three people once tangled in fear and misunderstanding, now standing in the same kitchen with a quiet kind of honesty. Marion squeezed his hand once before letting go, and the gesture carried a small grace I couldn't have imagined months earlier. Not redemption, but direction. Later, after she left, I walked into the backyard, letting the sunlight warm the back of my neck. The grass felt soft under my feet, and the hum of distant traffic blended with birdsong. I closed my eyes. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of all this, tiptoeing around suspicion, doubting my own instincts, convincing myself that discomfort was something to swallow rather than name. I thought about the moment I hid the camera, the moment I confronted the truth, the moment I finally stood still instead of shrinking. Growth isn't just about becoming stronger, it's about becoming clearer. And clarity had changed everything: my marriage, my sense of safety, my understanding of myself. That evening, as the sky turned a muted gold, I sat on the porch steps and watched the garage light flicker on. It glowed steady now, no longer a warning, but a quiet witness to every moment that had shaped us. Jake sat beside me, our shoulders touching lightly. "Do you think things will stay this way?" he asked. I didn't offer certainty, I offered truth. "Things will be what we choose to uphold," I said. "And we've learned how to choose better." He nodded, leaning his head softly against mine. The light washed over us, gentle, warm, unwavering. And there, in the fading evening, I realized something simple and steady. The danger had passed, but the clarity remained. And clarity, once earned, doesn't leave. It becomes the foundation you build on. In the end, the house didn't change all at once. It changed slowly, the way morning light crawls across a room before you notice it's there. The danger faded, but the clarity stayed. Marion learned to knock. Jake learned to listen. And I learned to trust myself again. Not the version of me that doubted every instinct, but the one who finally stood still long enough to see what was real. Some evenings, when the garage light flicks on outside, I'm reminded of the months when that same glow filled me with dread. Now it feels different. Steady. Honest.
a small promise that I'm no longer shrinking inside my own life. What remains isn't fear. It's the understanding that boundaries don't break families. Silence does. And choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you free. If you've ever been dismissed, misunderstood, or made to question your own reality, I hope this story reminds you that your voice matters, and that truth, once found, can change everything. Tell me in the comments, have you ever trusted your instinct even when no one else did? And before you go, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they're told.